So in this lesson, we're going to be looking at the consequences of the uneven development that we were looking at the causes of last lesson. So we're going to be looking at how wealth, health, and migration is sort of linked or impacted by uneven development. Okay, so we start off then looking at this HDI map of the world. And hopefully you can identify, and we're going to look at a few different maps as we go through this. So it's a key skill is describing and talking about these maps. So we'll do a bit of practicing on that because it's something you'll definitely need to use in your exam. So if you can get good at doing that, that's great, and we'll talk through that. So if we have a look at this map, then just very quickly, just glancing at it, hopefully we can sort of see that it reflects the data that we've been gathering, or close to the data we've been gathering. We can see the UK there with a very high figure above 0.9, so it's the darkest green, and we move down to Tanzania there, which has a figure here between 0.4 and 0.49, and then we move over to Malaysia, which sits between 0.7 and 0.79. Now, this might indicate to you, if you remember the numbers that we've had, that this might be a little bit out of date. Malaysia has breached into the green now. It's gone up to the 0.8 sort of category and above. So it should really, if this was a more up-to-date map, be coloured in light green. And that's always the case when we're looking at data. It moves forward in time. It's about development. It's about change. And this map was created at some point using some data. The data's moved on, but obviously the map hasn't followed yet. So just always be aware of that. That's the reason why it's maybe the wrong colour, or it's not wildly out. Malaysia is only just into the 0.8 number for HDI. So yeah, we can sort of see that pattern then across the world, and that's really important. We sort of recognise this pattern because that's what you're going to be writing about now. So the question you've got in your booklet to do is to write a paragraph describing the pattern that's shown. And it's really important. You can see I've underlined and I've also bolded that word describing there. And that's me sort of thinking about an exam question and the command word that I've been given. And if we sort of notice at the bottom here, and this is a key mistake point, especially from the best students still make this mistake. Okay, and it quite often is sort of the reason students don't end up getting 8s and 9s that they were hoping to, instead end up with sort of 6s and 7s, is because they don't read the question, they don't do exactly what the question says. So even a really good detailed answer, if it doesn't describe, if its focus isn't on that, then there aren't going to be any marks for it. And it's quite common actually that students make this mistake, so try and not let that be you. So you do not say why. You don't need to say why the countries are green, why the countries are red, why they're yellow. That isn't what this question is asking you. It just wants to know whereabouts they are. What's the pattern that the colours on the map are demonstrating to you? Okay. If the question wanted you to say why it was that North America, or most of North America, was dark green, then it would say explain the pattern shown, or explain this to you, and it doesn't say that. It just says describe. It just wants you to be able to identify where stuff is in the world. Okay. So obviously you've got space to be writing this. I'm going to sort of talk through my sort of 1, 2, 3, 4 strategy here, and you can pause the video as it's going to kind of help you do that. Or listen to this all and then sort of write it out yourself. However suits you is absolutely fine. So first of all then, I would start talking about the areas of high HDI. Okay, so I would sort of identify the two key areas, so the northern part of North America and Western Europe are the two areas with a large amount of dark green, which indicates it has a high human development above 0.9. I might also want to mention Japan and Australia, or Japan, Australia and New Zealand, as also having a high HDI. So I haven't listed all the countries there. I've mentioned a couple of countries, but I've talked about areas of the world. So I'm trying to talk about as much as possible of the world, of the map, without listing every single country. That would be a crazy answer, wouldn't it? So instead, areas, bits of continent, and maybe then a couple of extra examples added to that. So next, my next sentence, or my next section, is going to talk about the areas of low HDI. And as I can see, all of the countries with the lowest, let me just see, below 0.39 or 0.4, everywhere below 0.4 is located in Africa. I could be more specific, in Central Africa. Okay, and there are just a couple of examples of places outside the continent of Africa which fit that category. So again, I could mention them. So we've got Yemen and we've got Pakistan, who both have low human development, but they are in the higher category of low, the 0.4 to 0.49. Just as a point there, don't worry, any countries that are sort of grey on a map like this that link to not applicable or no data, you just ignore them. Don't talk about them. They're too complicated. There might be all sorts of reasons why. Here you've got Pakistan, you've got Somalia. It's generally linked to war. North Korea is on there as well, so that's linked to the fact that data collection is very difficult there. So you just ignore things like that. Okay, don't mention them. Pretend they're not there when you see them on a map. That's the best way to deal with them. Don't let them confuse you. Okay. So next is then the third part, then areas of medium HDI. So we'd be talking about, perhaps we could talk about South America. Okay, although the south of South America with Argentina, they're having a slightly higher level. It still sort of sits in that band of medium, doesn't it? Okay, and the country in South America, by the way, that is dark green is French Guiana. It's basically France, so that's why it's like that. So it's a colony of France. It's sort of run and owned by France, so it links back to the French HDI figure. You've also got then Northern Asia, yeah. So north part of Asia sits in that medium category. I mean, actually, most of Asia perhaps doesn't it? Okay, sits into that category. So you again could talk about that. You say, most of Asia except Japan, which is in the high. You've maybe already mentioned that. Tend to have the high a medium human development. Okay, and then finally, and we might have sort of done this already through it, but just in case we haven't, just anything that doesn't fit the pattern, any anomalies. So maybe we could mention, I'm trying to see what would be. I mean, we've mentioned the ones such as Yemen, and we've mentioned Pakistan as having lower figures within Asia than everywhere else. And we could talk about, most of the, I think, the north, we might have talked about the northern hemisphere being the area where the highest HDI is. However, it is also, Australia and New Zealand and the south of South America also have high human development. So they don't quite fit that pattern, do they? So it does depend on what you've said. You could even mention Mongolia there, which has a lower HDI than all the countries surrounding it. In Africa, you could talk about those countries to the north of Africa. Okay, you've got Algeria and Libya and Tunisia there, which all have quite high levels of development within them. So just picking out a few things that maybe just don't quite fit that pattern that you've described. You can have done, so part 4 there, you could have done through section 1, 2, and 3, or you can do it at the end separately. But do just try and do it. And that's all you've got to do. You're just talking about where the colours are on the map. Okay, make sure you use some numbers so they show that you're reading the key. So you're talking about 0.9 and 0.4 and below 0.6 or between 0.6 and 0.79. Just show the examiner that you can read it and that you can talk about the different colours here. Okay. So just another little point here, just to remember, because obviously we've been looking at that world map of HDI and thinking about a whole country, but don't forget that within a country, development can be very, very uneven. And just interesting, we'll look at sort of this stuff a bit later on in the unit when we look at the UK. But if you look at this map here, this is the average sort of earnings of people across the UK. And we can see there that there's quite a significant difference, isn't there, in terms of the amount of money that people might earn depending on whereabouts they live and work within the UK. And you can see obviously the highest average wages then lie within and around London, and the much lower are on the sort of more peripheral areas. So we can see sort of Wales and Lake Districts of Cumbria area, some of the areas of Scotland there as well, and Cornwall. So there's quite a significant difference, isn't there, in the salary levels of people across the UK. And that would be the same if we think about the sort of the levels of development within a country. It would be different across the country. So I don't want you to sort of sometimes when we see big maps and we see that sort of single color, we just think, oh, that's everybody's like that. Well, no, that's complete rubbish, isn't it? We all know that. But this really does demonstrate that. And we could go even further. You know, there'll be very rich people and very poor people in all of the different colors, won't there? So it's quite significant. It's quite important just to recognise that when we're looking at big data, that we can't forget that we are talking about individual people, and it sort of the data can narrow down. So I don't know what colour this would come out over. I guess it would come out at a sort of somewhere in between the sort of red. Probably the red colour would be the general average, maybe slightly darker red. In between the red and the purple would be the average for the whole of the country. Um, but that that's the sort of breakdown across the UK. So interesting to note, and we'll come back to this later, just the difference in salaries across the country, and the fact that the south or southeast has much higher levels than the rest of the rest of the country. Okay, so we're looking at then these three consequences of uneven development, and the consequences are there's a disparity in wealth, a disparity in health, and we have international migration. Um, So what does this term disparities, the word rather, disparities mean? Have a think about what you would understand that as meaning. Well, it basically means significant or big differences. So when something is disparate, when we're talking about a disparity, we're talking about things where there's a big difference between two or more things. Okay? So big differences in wealth, big differences in health, big different, or not so much big differences, but then international migration. Okay. So wealth disparities then. Basically, that's pretty straightforward understanding this. The greater the level of development, the greater the wealth. Okay. People in the wealthiest parts of the world have the best quality of life. They can afford to pay for healthcare, can pay for education, can pay for cars and things like that, which then improve their lives. Okay. And also enable them to make more money, thinking back to that cycle that we've looked at before. People in the poorest parts of the world can't do this. They can't buy those things. They can't afford to pay those things. They can't afford to access those things. And so therefore their quality of life is going to be poorer. So if we have a look then at this map of health disparities, we've got it's a map rather of life expectancy, okay, which obviously leads us to think about health. And we might notice, hopefully, that there is a very, very, very similar pattern here to the map we looked at on HDI. Okay, now obviously life expectancy feeds into HDI, but it's not the only thing, is it? But we can probably notice very much many of the sort of similar colour features, similar sort of pattern here that would be demonstrated as we've seen before. Okay, with the dark blue being pretty much what was the dark green. Okay, and you note you can see it, especially when you see it with the anomaly. So you can see Japan and Australia and New Zealand are clearly, they sort of stand out, don't they? If we look at the area of Africa that we saw before was the one bit that was sort of mainly red, and here we see again this is the one bit of the world that's mainly in sort of the orange and red colour there. So we can see there is a significant sort of link here, isn't there, between the data of HDI and just looking at life expectancy. Okay, perhaps this shows us how effective looking at one, is a reason that looking at one development indices is actually quite effective. It does work in most of the time. Okay, so richer countries generally have a higher life expectancy. For example, in the UK it is. Can we remember what the UK life expectancy figure is? It's 81. And for Tanzania it is. Can you remember? Yes, well done. It's 63. And this is because in the UK we have good healthcare and can often make people better when they get sick. And in Tanzania, the healthcare is less good. We could also talk about, quality of access to food and water and clean water and so on would perhaps be as important as healthcare. Okay. So international migration next then. So what does international migration mean? So it means moving from one country to another. Perhaps we could add to that to live. So we're not talking about tourism here, it's to live. Okay, so moving to live in a new country. That's what we mean by international migration. So on this map then, we've got, well, have a look at it. We've got a map that shows migration patterns. So it's not really clear the key and so on here, but what do you think the plus and the minus mean and the zero on our key? Obviously, we know what the grey, the question mark, just forget that. It's the plus, the zero, and the minus. That's the bit I'm wondering about. Okay, so the plus then means countries where there are people moving into, so their population is growing due to people arriving in the country. Okay, so they have a higher level of immigration into the country. And the minus shows countries where their population, where there is more people leaving the country than coming in, so more emigration, people leaving. Okay. And zero is where the numbers going in and the numbers that are leaving are balanced. Okay, so it's kind of the same. It's not showing a change. So the countries that are in the blue are the ones where the population is rising due to migration, and the ones in the brown are the ones where the countries are declining due to migration. So what's the pattern? So hopefully you can notice then the overall pattern is that the northern hemisphere has more migration into it. Okay, and you might also be able to link back to what we've seen in previous maps, that it is the areas of the world that have higher levels of development that, or higher levels of health even, but have the more people moving into them. That's not a rule, it's not absolutely definite, but in most cases, if you look at it, that is the case. Okay, that areas of the world with higher levels of development, people move to them. And that's kind of obvious, isn't it, really? You're not going to move from one country to another where the country's level of development is very low. You're going to move to a country where there's more chance of you getting a job, of your life improving. That's why you're going to migrate, isn't it? So there's no surprises there. So we can give a couple of examples then here to fit the pattern. So we've said, yeah, give the overall pattern. So for example, the USA and Australia both have positive migration. And for the sort of negative side, perhaps we could mention Niger, or we could mention India or China or Brazil are countries where people are tending to leave that country. Okay, there are more people leaving than coming in. So we're again showing our skills at being able to talk about the world, talk about the overall sort of patterns that we can see, and then picking out one or two little countries or little areas of the world that sort of back us up and support our answer. Any anomalies to this? Perhaps you might want to talk about there is an area in southern Africa, okay, where there are quite a few. There is more migration into those countries. Now, the most likely reason for that is that the countries surrounding them are significantly poorer, and it's much easier to move sort of from one country to another, isn't it, than moving across the whole world. So those countries are all located. If you look back and have a look at some of the HDI figures or in your booklet, you'll see there's some of the lower countries are actually close by. So people will be leaving their country in Africa that's very poor, and they'll go across the border. Very difficult for them to travel that thousands and thousands of miles if they're very poor. How they're going to be able to afford a plane ticket, or the being able to make that journey, to have the money to be able to make that journey is going to be a real challenge. So instead, they're leaving to a country nearby that's just slightly better than theirs. Okay, so that would sort of help us explain that anomaly. You don't need to explain it. That's just showing you why that might be the case. Okay. Uh, so, why does uneven development lead to international migration as a question? We've sort of started to explore that already, haven't we? But people in poorer countries move. Okay, so if there's uneven development, if one country is better than another one, people in the poorer country are going to look across the border and look at the other country and think, well, if I stay here, I'm going to be poor because I'm in that cycle of poverty. The government's not looking after us. There's not good health. There's not good education. My children are going to suffer. Whatever it might be, you've got lots of reasons. So if I move and I go to this country, if I go to that country over there, there are more good jobs for me. I can get better paid. The healthcare system is going to be better for me and for my family, and they'll have a chance of going on to university and better education. So why wouldn't you choose to leave? We think about if we think about the example of football, the Premier League. Think about how many people there are from African countries and from South America that have moved, and they moved to play in Europe. It's not just the Premier League, in the other leagues in Europe as well, because they'll get paid so much more money. So why wouldn't they choose to use that skill elsewhere? If they stayed within their home country and were brilliant at football, they're not going to make any money out of that, so it's not worth them doing it. So the other thing is that the access to the internet and social media, so a more recent thing, has meant that people know about the fact that there is a lot more wealth around the world. So people know that there is a development gap um, because it's being advertised to them, or they can, look on their phone and they can see what someone in the UK is doing on TikTok and what their life is like, or whatever it might be. And people in the poorer parts of the world have access to that, and as internet access becomes much more broad across the whole of the world and across the whole of the income spectrum, people know, and so they think, well, I'm going to move. So there's, just another point there that the prevalence of that ability to see and to communicate with the whole world that exists now means that more and more people are getting exposed to a life that they think, that would be amazing if I could live there. I bet amongst you guys it always is the case. America's amazing. It would be brilliant to live in America because you've seen the Kardashians or whatever, and you think that life is like that for everybody there. So people think, it'd be brilliant to go and move to the USA because my life would be like that. And that's the same for all different parts of the world. So there's sort of an advertising element to it as well that leads to more people, you know, going across borders to try and find a better life. Because it doesn't always work. They don't always get a better life, but they think they're going to. So recently, we've had, or relatively recently, we had a large migration of people into Germany. And it was in 2015 that Angela Merkel, the Chancellor for Germany, like their Prime Minister, announced that they would be really happy to accept any sort of migrants from across the world into Germany. So there was sort of an open door policy almost. Come to Germany and we'll give you homes. Now Germany is one of the richest countries in the world, most developed countries in the world, and they opened their borders. So 1.1 million people moved into Germany in 2015. There was a huge exodus of people sort of walking across, traveling across Europe to from the south mainly to get into Germany. Um, so why? Why did Germany open up their borders and say, "Come to Germany, migrants, come here. We'll accept you. We'll give you, there'll be jobs available for you. We'll give you those benefits. You'll be able to get access to healthcare. Your kids can go to school here." Why did they do it? Well, they did it linked to the population pyramids that we've seen before, and I'll pop it on in a moment. But the German population was getting very old. They're not having very many children in Germany, with women going to work and so on, and changes in the sort of form of the family. It meant that there were lots and lots of elderly people and much less people to do the work, less workers. Now, migration is brilliant because those 1.1 million migrants, the large majority of them will be people who are of working age. almost all of them will be people of working age, so between about sort of 16 and 50. Because if you're older than that, then you're too old to make that big journey. Then there's no real need for you to make that journey. What are you going to get? And if and yes, there'd be some people who were younger than that with children and so on as well. But even if you migrate as children, it's not very long. A few years' time, you're then going to be working, aren't you? So you're still bulking up the bottom of your population pyramid to provide more workers to be able to keep the country going. Obviously, there were some significant problems with this. You suddenly got a huge influx of people into the country with a different culture, with a different way of life, with maybe poor language skills. And so you've got to manage that. So, the schools then have lots of people speaking different languages. They've got to educate and work out how the teachers are going to deal with that. You've got the workplace, you've got people then being competed against in the workplace. So you've got suddenly loads more people who can do work. Then maybe the people that were in Germany originally sort of, they're concerned that they're going to maybe lose their jobs, that the jobs are not going to be as well paid anymore. So there are a number of different problems that can cause, but the whole point of it is to try and solve that problem. So we'll just have a quick look at the population just to remind ourselves. So, Germany's population pyramid looked very similar to the one on the left, although slightly smaller, narrower at the bottom and in the middle. That basically the idea was to sort of widen that bottom, widen the base out a little bit, okay, so that you've got plenty of people who are going to be able to work and be able to provide tax income and provide services, working as healthcare workers, working as cleaners, working in manufacturing, working making Mercedes and so on, and that's the whole idea here, and that was the reason why Germany opened up its borders, because it was worried that its population pyramid was going to turn into a sort of diamond shape almost, where the bottom was far too narrow, and they just wouldn't have enough workers. So they'd run out of workers, so therefore their companies and businesses wouldn't be able to make money, and there wouldn't be people to do the jobs that they needed to do. So they wanted to widen that base out, which is what happened. So finally then, a sort of big statement here for you to just have a little think about and see if you can answer this. It's quite a tricky one to consider. The language used is quite tricky, but actually it's quite a basic question if we break it down. And that's often the case with geography. We've got to break down what they're asking us into the sort of basics of it. So the question says, wealth inequality is a social problem. Discuss this statement. So in order to do that, we want to say, what is wealth inequality? It's when some people have lots and some people have a little, isn't it? Okay. And what's a social problem? Well, the social problem, we're talking then about lack of access to healthcare, people not going to school, poor education. Okay, they're the social problems. And so we can think, well, it's quite obvious, isn't it? If you have people who are rich and people who are poor, then the people who are rich, or the countries who are rich, are going to be able to access good health and good education, and the people who are poor are not going to be able to. Okay, and also if you've got a wealth disparity, people are going to want to move, so they're going to want to migrate, and if they migrate, then that causes problems as well, doesn't it, with sharing of cultures. It's a difficult one, isn't it? There are benefits and problems caused by this. Okay. So wealth inequality is a social problem. Just see if you can give a little answer to that and put your opinion into this. What do you think? Do you think wealth inequality is a social problem? Or is wealth inequality and social problems separate from that and they're not directly linked? Okay? And that's the end of today's lesson.